What happens when an 8-year-old girl asks Clint Eastwood a question that even the toughest men struggle to answer? In a quiet church hall, young Lily steps forward, clutching her grandmother's worn Bible, and asks a question that stops everyone in their tracks. "Mr. Eastwood, what does faith mean to you?" What follows is a powerful moment of reflection, as Clint shares a deeply personal story about loss, belief, and the lessons we carry from those who leave us too soon. His answer leaves the room in silence, but more importantly, it gives Lily and everyone listening something to hold on to. Don't miss this unforgettable story. Hit subscribe now for more powerful moments that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together. The air inside the Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, carried a quiet, almost sacred hum. The murmur of conversation drifted between the rows of wooden pews, blending with the occasional creak as someone shifted in their seat. Overhead, chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow, illuminating the high-arched ceiling and the worn hymnals stacked neatly along the walls. This was a place where generations had gathered, not just for Sunday worship, but for moments of community, for shared meals, for stories passed from one heart to another. But tonight there was no sermon, no choir singing softly in the background. Instead, the hall was filled with an expectant hush, the kind of quiet that comes just before something meaningful unfolds. At the front of the room stood Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor and filmmaker, now well into his later years, carried himself with the same quiet strength that had defined him for decades. His presence alone commanded attention, not through theatrics, but through an aura of certainty, of experience, of a man who had lived through much and spoken little about it. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the mix of young and old, families seated together, and individuals who had come simply to listen. His weathered features, marked by years in the harsh sun and under the bright lights of Hollywood, seemed somehow softer in this setting. Though his posture remained straight, there was something in the way he leaned just slightly against the wooden podium, a small, almost imperceptible sign that tonight was different from the roles he had played on screen. Among the crowd, in one of the middle rows, sat 8-year-old Lily. Her legs barely reached the floor, and her small hands clutched tightly around an old, weathered Bible. The leather cover cracked from years of use. The gold lettering on its surface had faded, but to Lily, it was a treasure, a piece of her grandmother that she could still hold on to. For weeks, she had prepared for this moment. Lying in bed at night, she had whispered the words under her breath, committing them to memory like a prayer. During the school day, she had scribbled them in the margins of her notebook, practicing until the letters blurred together. But no amount of practice could quiet the nervous flutter in her chest as she sat there now, gripping her Bible like a lifeline. Her mother, seated beside her, sensed the hesitation. She placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder, a silent encouragement, before leaning in to whisper the words she had said before they left the house. "Only if you're brave enough." Lily inhaled deeply. Her grandmother had always told her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing it anyway. And Lily was. The evening had unfolded with a steady rhythm. Clint Eastwood, ever composed, answered each question with the same measured confidence that had defined him for decades. The audience, a mix of longtime admirers and curious listeners, leaned in as he spoke about his early days in Hollywood, the craft of storytelling, and the evolution of the film industry. His words carried weight, shaped by years of experience, and though he was never one for long-winded speeches, each response was thoughtful, deliberate. Occasionally, a chuckle would ripple through the room at a well-placed remark, or a murmur of agreement would pass through the crowd when he spoke of perseverance, of grit, of lessons learned the hard way. Yet, despite the engagement, the energy in the hall remained reflective. This was not a rally, nor was it a performance. It was something quieter, something more personal. Then, the floor opened for personal questions. A few hands went up immediately. A man in the second row asked Clint about his directing process. Another inquired about his most challenging role. Each question was met with the same steady, composed demeanor. The audience had come expecting insight, wisdom from a man who had seen and done so much. But then, from the middle of the room, A small figure stirred. Lily hesitated. Her fingers, still wrapped tightly around the worn leather of her grandmother's Bible, trembled slightly. She could feel the weight of it against her palms, the same way she had felt the weight of the words she had rehearsed for so many nights. She wasn't sure if now was the right time. She wasn't sure if she was brave enough. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, her mother gave her a subtle nod. It was the smallest of gestures, but it was enough. Lily took a deep breath and stood. A ripple passed through the audience, the shifting of seats, the faint sound of whispers, the realization that someone unexpected was about to speak. A child. Clint's eyes followed the movement as the small girl stepped forward. She was tiny compared to the figures who had stood before him that evening, yet there was something about her presence, something steady, determined. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locked on him. Her voice, though trembling, refused to waver. "Mr. Eastwood, what does faith mean to you?" The question cut through the air like a shot in one of his old westerns. And just like that, everything stopped. The murmurs faded, the shifting seats grew still. Even the chandeliers overhead, their golden light flickering softly, seemed to hold their breath. For the first time that evening, Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent a lifetime portraying fearless gunslingers and unwavering heroes, found himself speechless. For a long moment, Clint Eastwood didn't speak. He simply stared at the little girl, then at the Bible she clutched so tightly to her chest. The leather was cracked with age, the gold lettering barely visible. It was old, well worn, not just a book, but something that had been held, read, and cherished for years. Something in his expression changed. Not surprise, not discomfort, something deeper. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs, was now utterly still. Lily's question lingered in the air, heavier than any question about movies or filmmaking. It was the kind of question that didn't come with a rehearsed answer, the kind that made a man look inward before he spoke. Clint exhaled. Slowly, he leaned against the podium, his fingers resting on the edge as if grounding himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, softer, carrying a weight that hadn't been there moments ago. "That's a big question, kid," he said, his tone thoughtful. "And it's not one I've always had an answer to." His gaze drifted over the crowd, taking in the expectant faces before returning to Lily. "But I'll tell you a story." Clint's voice was steady, but there was something in it, a weight, a hint of something personal that hadn't been there before. "You know, kid, I once knew a man, a damn good man. His name was Sergio Leone." The audience leaned in, sensing that this wasn't just another Hollywood anecdote. This was something deeper. "When I was young, just another nameless actor, I didn't know where my life was headed. I was working odd jobs, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then came Sergio." He paused for a moment, as if picturing that first meeting. "He saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. He gave me a shot. He believed in me when no one else did. And because of that, my whole life changed." For a man like Clint Eastwood, who had built a legacy on strength and independence, admitting that his success had begun with someone else's belief in him felt significant. Sergio Leone hadn't just given him a role, he had given him direction, purpose. Clint's fingers curled slightly against the podium. His voice, though measured, carried an undertone of emotion. And then, one day, he was gone. No warning, no goodbyes, just gone. The room was silent. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her Bible. She had never heard of Sergio Leone, but she didn't have to. She understood loss. She understood what it meant to have someone shape your life, only to lose them too soon. Clint's gaze flickered, just briefly, to the Bible in her hands. "I remember thinking, why? Why do the good ones go too soon? Why does life take people away before we're ready?" His voice was quieter now, but the question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Clint let the words linger in the air, as if waiting to see if there was an answer hidden somewhere in the silence. "I spent a long time trying to figure it out," he continued, his voice measured, thoughtful. "Looking for answers. But you know what I learned?" He let his gaze settle on Lily, his piercing blue eyes softer now, lacking the sharp intensity they once held. She was young, yet her question carried a weight that few adults dared to ask. "Some things you're not meant to understand," he exhaled slowly. "You're just meant to trust that there's something bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than all of this." He lifted a hand, gesturing, not just at the church, not just at the people sitting before him, but at something unseen, something beyond the walls of that room. Maybe it's fate, maybe it's destiny, maybe it's something we'll never have the words for. They had come to know him as a man of action, of certainty. And yet, here he was, admitting that some things in life were beyond understanding. Lily's small fingers traced the worn edges of her grandmother's Bible, her mind turning over his words. She had spent so many nights wondering the same thing: why people had to leave, why life took away the ones who mattered most. Finally, she blinked, her wide eyes shimmering under the soft glow of the chandeliers. "My grandma used to say that too," she whispered. "She said people never really leave us. They stay in the things they taught us." Clint gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. For the first time that evening, he wasn't the one giving wisdom. He was receiving it. The room remained quiet, as if even the air itself was holding still. "The people we lose," Clint continued, his voice steady but softer now, "they never really leave us. They live on, in the things they taught us, in the way they changed us, in the pieces of themselves they left behind." His words hung in the silence, settling deep into the hearts of those listening. Lily's grip on her Bible loosened slightly. Her question hadn't been meant to challenge or test Clint. It had come from a place of longing, of searching. And yet, somehow, his answer had reached a place inside her that she hadn't even known needed healing. She thought of her grandmother, of the stories she had told, the lessons she had shared, the warmth of her voice. Maybe Clint was right. Maybe people weren't really gone, as long as we carried them with us. A murmur rippled through the audience. Heads nodded, eyes glistened. No one spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding. Clint wasn't just talking about himself anymore. He was speaking to all of them. For the first time that evening, the room didn't feel so heavy with loss. It felt full. Clint took a slow step forward, his boots making the faintest sound against the wooden floor. His posture remained steady, but there was something in his voice now, something deeper, something more certain. "We spend our lives searching for meaning, for reasons, but maybe the answers aren't always outside of us." He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the audience. Some people looked down, lost in thought. Others held on to the moment, as if afraid it would slip away too soon. Then, he looked at Lily one last time. "Maybe faith isn't about knowing," he said. "Maybe it's about believing." Lily blinked, and a single tear slid down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't sadness. It wasn't loss. It was something else, something lighter, something stronger. She inhaled deeply, straightening her shoulders. She had come searching for an answer, and maybe, in some way, she had found one. The silence in the room gave way to soft applause, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of what had just transpired. It wasn't the kind of applause meant for a grand speech or a performance. It was something more intimate, more genuine. Clint leaned down slightly, his eyes level with Lily's. "Thank you, Lily." His voice was low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Lily nodded, then hesitated for only a moment before extending her small hand. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for answering." Clint shook her hand gently, offering a faint but genuine smile. Then, as he turned to leave, the room felt different, as if something had been left behind. not in words, but in something much deeper, something that would stay with them long after the night was over. Some questions are simple, some are impossible, but sometimes the ones that seem the hardest to answer are the ones that bring us closer to what really matters. Lily had asked a question that many adults were too afraid to voice, and in doing so, she had reminded everyone in that room, including Clint Eastwood himself, that faith isn't always about certainty. Sometimes it's about trusting in something greater, even when the path isn't clear. The room had been filled with stories, with silence, with understanding. And as people slowly rose from their seats, there was a shared feeling that something had shifted, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in a quiet, lasting one. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. And if you found something meaningful here, share it with someone who might need it today. Subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.